All right, well, let's get underway. Welcome to All Things Fulfilled. And today we're venturing into another chapter and perhaps one of the most controversial in all the book of Revelation and one of the most disputed chapters and with some of the most disputed themes in the book. But we're going to look at it, do the very best we can with it. And then after this chapter, we'll be moving on to chapter 21, which is a chapter that has all of the blessings in it for the most part. At any rate, we're talking about the binding of Satan, and this coincides with the millennial reign, which we will be saying something about as we move forward in the study. It is the time of the pre-parousia reign. That's one of the disputed points that we encounter when studying Revelation chapter 20, but it's the pre-parousia reign of Christ and the saints. And I think that comes out clear in some of the verses that we will be discussing on next week. The question is, how and in what manner was Satan bound, and what does that mean in terms of the text and the circumstances surrounding that? It does not mean that there would be a utopia. Some people tend to have the idea that, there's this reign of peace on earth during the time of the millennium. And I think that runs counter to what the text is speaking of. It's not about the end of all evil on the earth. And that very idea, for people who study the scriptures, I think is very detrimental to understanding what Christ has done. Also, it was not the chief concern with the binding of Satan that there would be this era of, unbridled peace, so to speak. But the focus or the objective for the binding of Satan is clearly stated that he should deceive the nations no more. And so we're going to take a look at this for just a moment as we study this particular text in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. Let me see if I can get it where I can get the text in front of, well, I can't put it in front of you because I got it on a different computer here. But nevertheless, we'll look at it and talk about it. So give me just a minute. I want to at least read the text for you. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. Now, as we said, that one of the main purpose behind the binding of Satan was that he should deceive the nations no more. And so that's where the attention and the focus should be, on the binding of Satan, and not on whether or not there's going to be this unending reign of peace on earth, as we have been told by the dispensationalists from that perspective. And then, of course, after that millennial reign, then, as they say, all hell would break loose. But that's not the idea. It's about his not deceiving the nations and what that entails. So to deceive, of course, is purposely communicating a message of untruth. And that means we ask ourselves the question of what truth, or what is it that Satan attempted to pervert or to deceive the nations with? What is it that was so crucial that it required deceiving the nations? There had to be some loss or negative consequence involved. Now, in Psalm 2:8, the text says, "Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel." The objective of Christ and the church was to rule over the nations, Revelation 2:25 through 27. And we just finished talking about that with the war of the Messiah in Revelation 19 and verse 15. The rule over the nations could only be exercised through the rod of iron, because that's what the text says, that he would rule over the nations with a rod of iron. And the rod of iron, of course, is also presented as the scepter of righteousness. In Hebrews 1 and verse 8, the text says, "But to the Son he says, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor," Isaiah 11 and verse 4, "and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked." So righteousness is very, very important in this reign of Christ. We've talked about that in the past. In Isaiah 11 and 5, he says, "Righteousness shall be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt of his waist." So as long as the rod of truth from the breath of Christ's mouth prevails, Satan could not deceive the nations any longer. And as we said before, from Galatians, Paul talked about the idea of the perversion of truth, but we'll get to that in a moment. In Romans 1:16 and 17, he says, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now, from that perspective, it's showing us that the means through which righteousness was concerned, so that the nations would have the truth, as the scriptures talk about the gospel going to all the nations, was by means of the gospel, which of course was spoken through the words of the apostles, and of course of the saints as well, that had come from Jesus Christ, had been revealed to them through Christ. And therefore his activity in some way had to distort the meaning of, or offer some substitute for, the gospel that was at least in some way believable by those to whom it was preached. And so his aim was to capture the allegiance of the saints and of the nations. And he said to them, "All these things I will give you." For example, when he tempted Christ, he says, "I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Now, when we look in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3 and verses thereafter, it gives us a specific example of the nature, the objects, and the source of deception. Now, this is where I think that the deceiving of the nations comes in from on the stand on the point of from the standpoint of Satan. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, "But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." So there was a corrupting element. There was something through which they would be deceived. Let's see what Frank Daniel says. He says, "The enemy, not Satan, that deceived the people was the ritual." Well, Frank, I think if you keep listening, you might find some affinity in what you're saying and what I'm saying, especially as we look at this point right now that we are considering. But I appreciate the comments that you've entered there. But nevertheless, as we're looking at 2 Corinthians 11:3, as Paul said, he's talking about their minds being corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. "For if he who comes preaches another Jesus, whom you have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit, which you have not received, or a different gospel, which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it." So what is he talking about? He leads them into this story and into his teaching by drawing their minds back to the garden and the deception that was spoken of there. And now he's talking about their minds being corrupted by someone preaching another Jesus, by someone preaching another gospel and receiving a different spirit. So there is some deception that's going on here. He's identified as working with the false apostles at Corinth. And in verse 13, he says, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers. So there's the deception that's coming in. Deceitful workers transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel or a messenger of light. Now, oftentimes when we see the word angel, we tend to think of these almost transparent beings with wings, etc., flying around in the sky. But I don't think that's the idea here. He's talking about a messenger, someone that communicates, and that's the idea. And that's what even the deceitful workers who transformed themselves into the apostles of Christ were doing. They were communicating messages, and these messages were deceptive. They were corruptive. They were bringing a different gospel. And so he says, therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into the ministers of righteousness. Notice, they are transforming themselves into ministers of righteousness, but they were not ministers of righteousness. And we pointed out with the gospel and with the words that came from the breath of Jesus's mouth and from those who were following him, like the armies in heaven in Revelation 19:11 and following, they too would rule with a rod of iron. And of course, it was through that rod of iron or righteousness that Christ was ruling. And so he says to them that it was no great thing that if his ministers also transformed themselves into the ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. Well, that's also the subject that we are looking at in Revelation that we've discussed in past weeks about the end of the beast, the end of the false prophet, etc. And I think that's what's being spoken of here when he talks about whose end will be according to their works. They were Judaizers. Paul said in verse 23 or 22, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they the ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. So he's talking about Judaizers who had come to infect the church with their deceptive doctrines, and we know pretty much what those were all about. Doctrines such as, you can't be saved unless you are circumcised, unless you keep the law of Moses. And even though there were Jews who were doing this, some took it to an extreme. Well, let me correct that. There were Jews who were keeping the law, but they weren't keeping the law for justification. They had an understanding of the fact that the law didn't save them. And as Peter told them in Acts chapter 15, they would be saved just as were the Gentiles who were saved without coming under the bondage of the law. But nevertheless, they were commanded to keep it at least up to the point of 70 AD. And there's evidence out there that, there were those who were yet keeping it even beyond that point. But that wasn't a requirement for them to do so beyond 70 AD. So this is why we said from the text in Galatians 1, when Paul marveled, saying that there were those who were turning away so soon from him who called them into the gospel of Christ to a different gospel. Well, that's what he was talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that there were some preaching a different gospel. He says, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. That sounds to me very much like what the subject matter was in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, with the deception that was going on with them transforming themselves into angels of righteousness or ministers of righteousness, etc. And so he repeats that, as we've said before, so say I now again, if any man preaches any other gospel than that which you have received, let him be accursed. And then in chapter 2, he spoke of their coming in as spies to infiltrate, to subvert. And this occurred, as he said, because of false brethren, secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. So their whole aim was to turn the church back to the law and to subvert those who had never been under the law into serving God according to the law of Moses. And so he says, to whom we did not yield submission, even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. So as we look in Revelation 20, and we compare the text specifically that talks about this angel that came down out of heaven and having the key to the bottomless pit, this lets us know that the subject matter here, the bottomless pit, etc., aligns with what was said back in Revelation chapter 9. Now, again, we have to understand that these things are not necessarily in chronological order. They're in thematic order, and so we have to look at them from that, or at least they're thematic, and we have to look at them from that perspective. But let's note a few things from that text and see if we see some identity or identifying characteristics in Revelation chapter 9, along with what's being said here in Revelation chapter 20. It says, and they had a king over them, the angel or messenger of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew is Abaddon or Abaddon, but in the Greek he has the same name, Apollyon. And that's Revelation 9 and verse 11. Then it talks about his army. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. You know, it's strange that when you go out and you talk to some of these people, they are expecting this battle in our future where there's going to be a battle against 200 million, a 200 million man army with Black Hawk helicopters and the whole 9 yards. None of that has anything to do with the book of Revelation. We've got enough wars. We don't need another one from that perspective. And but nevertheless, can you imagine the devastation of 200 million men in a war, and the amount of killing that would entail, as though we don't have enough. 22, we did not have on the wedding garments and were cast out. Stephen, I believe that is the case. I think you can even see a more specific one in in Luke chapter 19, where they said, we will not have this man to reign over us. So I think they're all dealing with that same subject matter. As we continue in Revelation 9, as he said, now the number of the army of horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions. And notice now, out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. So what we have here is a situation where those who were following with Christ, and particularly Christ, as the text said, out of his mouth he will rule the nations with a rod of iron, or he will strike the nations as well. Then we have this text speaking about the angel from the bottomless pit and the armies that followed him. And notice it says out of their mouth. So what we're dealing with is communication here. What we're dealing with are those who are bringing a message. Now, if Christ is bringing a message of righteousness, they have to be bringing a message of deception. And this is how they are influencing them. So we're not talking about literal horses here and, literal armies from that perspective of locusts or anything of that nature. We're talking about individuals, and the power that they have is the power that's coming from their mouth. It's their words. It's their teaching. That is the real issue. He says, for their power is in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. Notice they are likened to serpents as well. in Matthew chapter 3. John the Baptist, speaking of the Sadducees and Pharisees and those who came out to his baptism who were not sincere in heart, he spoke of them as a brood of serpents. Jesus did the same thing in Matthew chapter 23, and there were several warnings by the apostles that told them to beware of those who were like serpents. And so this is a designation. It's also spoken of in Deuteronomy chapter 32, speaking of the last days of Israel. So I think this is kind of the idea, if not the very idea, of what's being referred to in these passages. So the angel comes down out of heaven. Well, a couple of more texts that we'll look at in that connection when he says that their power was in their mouth, in their tails, for their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. So again, the primary focus is the harm that they're doing with their mouths, and I think this is the deception that is being spoken of. So the angel comes down out of heaven to bind Satan, and he binds the angel of the bottomless pit and has this key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand, lays hold on the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. Now, we have this designation, all these descriptive terms that speak of him. He's called the dragon, which is some kind of a serpent. That word means to fascinate, some fabulous one, so to speak. The serpent of old, which means that he was cunning and malicious. And, again, remember those designations that Jesus made of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He was called Diabolos, which was a false accuser and a deceiver. So he's being described in the very terms that speak of the nature of what was taking place. And of course, he's called Satan, and that identifies him with the one in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10. Now, in that text, notice something else regarding how the saints approach that situation. Of course, that's the time where the war breaks out in heaven, Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, and the war between Michael and his angels and the devil and his angels, or the dragon and his angels, and the dragon was cast out to the earth. Well, of course, at that point, he became furious. And so in Revelation 12 and verse 10, notice he says, "Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down." Now, wait a minute. Look at what he's doing. He's accusing them, falsely accusing them, and in so doing, deceiving others who might be interested in following them and persuading them not to do so as a result of these accusations. The text says, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb." So look at what they're fighting with, if you please. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. So what are they doing? They're countering the deception with truth. They're countering the deception with the righteousness of the gospel. This is how they overcame him, by the word of their testimony. And the text says they did not love their lives to the death. They were willing to die for the message that they taught. Just as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, "If any man comes after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." And of course, the cross was symbolism for death. They committed themselves to that, just like Revelation 2 and verse 10 says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life." And so to accuse the brethren day and night in the presence of God means that they had access to the throne of God, which I would take to mean some access to the temple and or concept of the temple, whether we look at it from the temple in Jerusalem or we look at it from a more spiritual aspect. But I think from one perspective, it would be the temple in Jerusalem if we are identifying who they were. And so when you look, for example, back in Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 1, the text says, "Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to oppose him." So again, that's a temple scene. That's a temple scenario. But there is Satan standing to oppose him. And that may give you some indication, again, of what's taking place regarding their access to this to the heavens from that perspective. Now, it is the priests and the council in Jerusalem who do the accusing of the saints. Over and over again, you see where they are making accusations. They did that of Christ, and they're doing it to the saints as well. Let's look at some passages here in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 10, and also a parallel text in Mark 3 and 2. Notice how they approached Jesus in his ministry. It says, "And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him." So they were looking for ways to accuse Jesus. They were looking for ways to disrupt his ministry, to subvert his ministry. It says again in Luke 11:53, "And as he said these things to them, the scribes and the Pharisees began to assail him vehemently and to cross-examine him about many things, lying in wait for him and seeking to catch him in something that he might say, that they might accuse him." So you can see this battle is being fought with words, if you please. Of course, they're attacking his actions, but they're doing so in order to try and communicate to the people that Jesus is a blasphemer rather than being the Son of God. In John chapter 8 and verse 5, at the time when they bring the woman who was accused of adultery before them and before Christ, it says, "Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say?" They said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. They weren't concerned about the woman, about her welfare, or even about her sin for that matter. What they were concerned about was finding a way to accuse the Lord. And so they were saying, Moses said she should be stoned, but what do you say? They knew that if Jesus had, commanded that, he would have been, fighting against Rome, etc., from that perspective. And so they're simply trying to accuse him. And again, at the time of his arrest, it says, "And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." And when Pilate examined him, Pilate called together, notice, the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people." See, they are deceiving the people regarding Christ. "And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him." Who were his accusers? The chief priests, the rulers, and the people. And again in Matthew 27 and 12, "And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing." So, when you think about the deception that was being done, as we looked at in Corinth, by those who were corrupting their minds from the truth, and you look at those in Revelation 9, who out of their mouths they were hurting and bringing these accusations, and then look at the chief priests, the rulers, and the Sadducees, I think we're getting a clear picture of who these deceivers were. And let's see, Eric says in Revelation 18:23, Babylon, or Jerusalem, was judged for the sorcery she used to deceive the nations. Excellent point, Eric. This correlates with Satan, or correlates Satan with the apostate Jews, since they were both using deception. That is precisely the truth. And it looks like I'm not nearly finished with this message today, but we'll talk more about this on next week when we come back But I think it's a good foundation being laid in terms of the deceivers that was taking place, the accusers that were found from this one called Satan, his armies, and how they were doing so, and how that was being uh, uh, opposed by the church. Now, this is also going to take us back to what happened or what kind of situation that created for the church in terms of whether or not this meant a reign of peace or a utopia in the binding of Satan, which I think a lot of people think. And so that's not the case. But at any rate, that's the message for this morning. Let me see if I can give a quick shout out to the people who are here, and any I miss, that's either because I can't see you. But let's see. I know we have Eric, we have Deb, Tyrone. Good morning to all of you. To Calvin, good to see you again. To Richard, Beatrice, Frank, and Gail, Roosevelt. Let's see, Stephen, Ann, Bishop, Dale, and who else? Andre. Let's see. Did I get them all? And Jose as well. So I think that's all that I can see on the list. Once again, I want to thank you for being present with us this morning. We look forward to being back on next week. We will continue this subject, and this will probably run a few series as we deal with the binding of Satan. So thank you once again for tuning in, and we will see you in the next broadcast.